Imagine quitting a stable job at 26 years old, with no diploma and no business experience, to follow the advice of a book written decades before you were born. This is the true story of Bob Proctor, the man who made the riskiest decision of his life and transformed an impossible dream into a $100 million empire. But the price of that choice was greater than he ever imagined. Would you have the courage to leave everything behind for a dream? Tell us in the comments, what was the riskiest decision you've ever made in your life? The decision that shocked everyone. The morning of March 15th, 1961, dawned cold and grey over Toronto. Inside Fire Station 19, the familiar sounds of routine preparation echoed through the red brick building. Boots being polished, equipment being checked, coffee brewing in the station kitchen. But for Bob Proctor, this Tuesday morning would mark the end of everything familiar and the beginning of something that seemed utterly impossible. Bob had spent sleepless nights wrestling with a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. The worn copy of Think and Grow Rich sat on his nightstand, its pages now familiar territory after countless readings. Napoleon Hill's words had ignited something deep within him, a burning conviction that his current life was just a shadow of what was possible. The fire station locker room was filled with the usual morning chatter as firefighters prepared for their shifts. These men were Bob's brothers in every sense that mattered. They had faced danger together, shared stories, celebrated victories, and mourned losses. The brass pole gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the red truck stood ready for whatever emergencies the day might bring. This was security, stability, respect. Everything a working-class man could reasonably hope for. But as Bob removed his badge and uniform for the last time, his hands trembled not with fear, but with an electric anticipation that bordered on madness. His fellow firefighters watched in stunned silence as he approached Captain Morrison's office. The conversation that followed would become legendary in the station's history. "Captain," Bob said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do, "I'm turning in my resignation, effective immediately." Captain Morrison, a 20-year veteran who had seen firefighters come and go for every imaginable reason, stared at Bob in complete bewilderment. "Proctor, what the hell are you talking about? You've got a good record here, steady pay, benefits. What's gotten into you?" Bob's response sounded insane, even to his own ears. "I'm going to start a business, Captain. I'm going to become wealthy." The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the laughter, not cruel, but the kind of gentle ridicule reserved for someone who has clearly lost their grip on reality. "Bob," the captain said, shaking his head, "you dropped out of high school. You've never run a business. You don't have any money." "What kind of business are you talking about?" "Cleaning," Bob replied simply. "I'm going to start with cleaning, and then I'm going to build something bigger than anything you can imagine." Word of Bob's resignation spread through the station like wildfire. In the locker room, veteran firefighters shook their heads in disbelief. "That poor bastard's lost his mind," whispered Jerry Collins, a 15-year veteran. "Reading too many books will do that to you." But the most devastating reaction came from Bob's mother. When he arrived at her modest house on Queen Street that evening, the conversation that followed would haunt him for months to come. The living room, with its faded floral wallpaper and worn furniture, had always been a sanctuary of unconditional love and support. But when Bob announced his decision, his mother's face crumpled with a mixture of disappointment and terror. "Bobby, what have you done?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "You had security, you had respect. People looked up to you, and now you're throwing it all away for what? Some crazy idea from a book?" The tears in his mother's eyes cut deeper than any criticism from his colleagues. Here was the woman who had sacrificed everything to give him whatever opportunities she could, and now he was telling her that her sacrifices weren't enough, that he needed something more, something she couldn't understand or support. "Mom, I can't explain it," Bob said, reaching for her hand. "But I know this is what I have to do. I know it seems crazy, but there's something inside me that won't let me stay where I am. That night, alone in his apartment, Bob faced the first wave of what would become months of paralyzing doubt. The familiar sounds of the city outside his window seemed different now, no longer the backdrop to a stable life, but the soundtrack to an uncertain future. He had burned his bridges, abandoned his safety net, and committed himself to a path that had no guarantees. The book that had inspired this dramatic change lay open on his kitchen table, but now Hill's confident words about desire and faith seemed almost mocking in the harsh light of reality. What had he done? What had he really, truly done? The first months of hell. The romantic notion of following one's dreams collided brutally with reality in the weeks that followed Bob's resignation. The Toronto of 1961 was a city where steady employment was a blessing not to be taken lightly, and Bob quickly discovered that enthusiasm was no substitute for capital, experience, or connections. His savings, modest to begin with, evaporated with terrifying speed. The basic equipment needed to start a cleaning business, industrial vacuum cleaners, cleaning supplies, transportation, required an investment that stretched his resources beyond their limits. The van he purchased was third-hand and unreliable, breaking down at the worst possible moments and leaving him stranded with equipment he couldn't afford to replace. The first potential clients were a humbling lesson in the gap between dreams and reality. Bob would arrive at office buildings in downtown Toronto, wearing his best suit and carrying what he hoped was an air of professional confidence, only to be dismissed by receptionists who took one look at his makeshift operation and politely declined his services. "We already have a cleaning service, thank you," became the most common response, delivered with the kind of smile that barely concealed pity for someone so obviously out of their depth. More brutal were the building managers who simply laughed at his proposals, unable to believe that this former firefighter thought he could compete with established companies that had been serving Toronto's business district for decades. The nights were the worst. Alone in his apartment with unpaid bills stacking up on the kitchen table and his bank account dwindling towards zero, Bob was forced to confront the possibility that everyone who had called him crazy might have been right. The confidence that had carried him through his resignation began to crumble under the weight of repeated rejections and mounting financial pressure. Sleep became elusive. Bob would lie awake, staring at the ceiling and running endless calculations in his head. How long his remaining money would last, how many potential clients he would need to contact to secure just one contract, whether it was too late to go back to the fire department and beg for his job back. The isolation was perhaps more devastating than the financial stress. The firefighters, who had once been his closest friends, now avoided him, uncomfortable with the reminder of his seemingly catastrophic decision. Family dinners became exercises in carefully avoiding the topic of his business venture, with relatives exchanging meaningful glances when they thought he wasn't looking. By month 3, Bob had reached what seemed like the bottom. His landlord was demanding overdue rent. His van had suffered another expensive breakdown, and he had been rejected by every major office building in downtown Toronto. The dream that had seemed so vivid and achievable just months before now felt like the delusion of a man who had fundamentally misunderstood his own capabilities. It was during this darkest period that Bob seriously considered admitting defeat. The fire department would probably take him back. Captain Morrison had made it clear that he thought Bob would come to his senses eventually. The steady paycheck, the camaraderie, the respect of the community, it all seemed infinitely more appealing than the grinding humiliation of failed entrepreneurship. But something prevented Bob from making that call. Perhaps it was stubborn pride, or perhaps it was the memory of how trapped he had felt in his old life. Or perhaps it was Napoleon Hill's words, which continued to echo in his mind, even during the darkest moments. Every adversity, every failure, Every heartache carries with it the seed of an equal or greater benefit. The question that haunted Bob during those hellish months wasn't whether he had made a mistake. It was whether he had the strength to endure long enough to discover whether his instincts had been right or wrong. What do you think about what you've seen so far? Do you believe Bob Proctor was being brave or just recklessly naive? Have you ever faced a moment where you had to choose between security and the unknown? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The miraculous turning point. The morning of June 8, 1961 began like so many others during Bob's nightmare period, with the metallic taste of desperation and the crushing weight of bills he couldn't pay. His alarm clock's shrill cry echoed through the small apartment that had become both sanctuary and prison. But something was different about this particular morning, though Bob couldn't have articulated what it was. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source, a chance encounter at a coffee shop on Bay Street. Bob had been nursing a single cup of coffee for over an hour, trying to stretch his remaining money as far as possible while reviewing his dwindling list of potential clients. At the next table, two businessmen were engaged in an animated conversation about their frustration with their current cleaning service. They show up when they want to, do half the job, and charge like they're doing us a favor, complained the older man, whose expensive suit and gold watch suggested significant business success. I swear, if I could find someone reliable who actually cared about doing good work, I'd fire these clowns tomorrow. Bob's heart began to race. This was the opportunity he had been praying for, but his approach had to be perfect. Too eager, and he would seem desperate, too casual, and the moment would pass forever. He waited until the men were preparing to leave, then approached their table with what he hoped was confident professionalism. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Bob said, extending his hand. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about cleaning services. I'm Bob Proctor, and I run a commercial cleaning operation here in Toronto. I wonder if I might have a moment to discuss how we could solve your problems." What followed was the most important conversation of Bob's life. The older man, whose name was Harold Kemp, owned a 12-story office building in the heart of Toronto's financial district. His current cleaning service had become increasingly unreliable, and he was genuinely desperate for an alternative. But Bob knew this wasn't just about cleaning floors and emptying trash cans. This was about proving that Napoleon Hill's principles could transform impossible dreams into concrete reality. As he listened to Kemp describe his needs, Bob began to visualize not just meeting those needs, but exceeding them so dramatically that this contract would become the foundation of something much larger. The negotiation that followed tested every principle Bob had absorbed from Think and Grow Rich. Kemp was skeptical. Here was a young man with no track record, no references from major clients, and equipment that looked barely adequate for such a large contract. But Bob's absolute conviction and detailed understanding of what superior service would look like gradually won Kemp over. "I'll tell you what, Proctor," Kemp said finally. "I'll give you a 1-month trial. But I'm warning you, if you disappoint me, you're done. And if you perform the way you're promising, this could be the beginning of a very profitable relationship for both of us." The contract was worth $8,000 per month, more money than Bob had ever imagined earning from a single client. But as he walked back to his apartment that afternoon, clutching the signed agreement like a life preserver, he knew that the real test was just beginning. This is where Bob Proctor's story reveals something profound about the nature of success and human potential. What Bob had discovered, without fully understanding it at the time, was the power of theta brainwaves, the same mental state that allows the subconscious mind to access creative solutions and break through insights that are invisible to ordinary consciousness. Modern neuroscience has now proven what Bob experienced intuitively. Dr. James Rivers, a neuroscientist with connections to NASA, has developed the Genius Wave, a 7-minute audio program that uses advanced brain entrainment technology to activate the same theta state that Bob Proctor accessed naturally during his transformation. While Bob spent years learning to achieve this mental state through repetitive study and visualization, the Genius Wave offers a scientific shortcut to the same cognitive breakthrough in just 7 minutes per day. The program uses specially designed audio frequencies to synchronize your brainwaves with the theta state, unlocking the same creative problem-solving abilities that transformed Bob from a struggling entrepreneur into a millionaire. For just $39, you can download the same brainwave patterns that took Bob years to develop through trial and error. The program comes with a 90-day money-back guarantee, so you can experience this transformation risk-free. The link is in the description below. Bob threw himself into the Kemp contract with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He arrived at the building at 5 a.m. and often didn't finish until well past midnight. But this wasn't just about working harder. It was about working with a level of precision and attention to detail that transformed cleaning from a mundane service into something approaching artistry. Every surface gleamed, every corner was spotless, every piece of trash was removed before it could accumulate. Bob didn't just meet Kemp's expectations, he exceeded them so dramatically that within weeks, other tenants in the building were asking who was responsible for the dramatic improvement in cleanliness and maintenance. Word spread through Toronto's business community with surprising speed. Within 6 months, Bob's client list had grown to include some of the city's most prestigious office buildings. The van that had once seemed like an extravagant expense was replaced by a small fleet of vehicles, and Bob found himself hiring employees to handle the growing demand for his services. But perhaps the most significant change was in Bob himself. The desperation and fear that had characterized his first months as an entrepreneur were replaced by an unshakable confidence in his ability to create whatever reality he could clearly visualize. The principles in Think and Grow Rich were no longer theoretical concepts, but practical tools that he used daily to expand his business and his vision of what was possible. Thank you so much for staying with us this far in Bob Proctor's incredible journey of transformation. Your engagement means everything to us, and I promise you, the best part of this story is still to come. What you've witnessed so far is just the beginning of a saga that would ultimately influence millions of people and create one of the most controversial business empires in the personal development industry. The hidden price of success. Success, Bob Proctor discovered, was not the simple blessing he'd imagined during those desperate months of struggle. As his cleaning business expanded throughout Toronto and then into other Canadian cities, the man who had once felt invisible began to experience the complex burden of becoming somebody that others noticed, envied, and judged. The first casualty was his relationships with the firefighters who had once been his closest friends. When Bob encountered his former colleagues at neighborhood bars or community events, the conversations were strained and artificial. These were good men who had chosen security and steady advancement within a respected institution, and Bob's meteoric success felt like an implicit criticism of their more cautious choices. "Look at Proctor," Bob overheard Jerry Collins saying at Murphy's pub one evening. "Acts like he's some kind of genius now, too good for the guys who used to have his back. Money changes people, and not always for the better." The accusation stung because it contained an uncomfortable grain of truth. Bob's growing obsession with business expansion and wealth creation had indeed changed him. The easy camaraderie and simple pleasures that had once defined his social life now seemed trivial compared to the intoxicating challenge of building something significant. Even more painful was the gradual erosion of his relationship with his mother. The woman who had once worried about his financial security now worried about his spiritual well-being. "You're becoming someone I don't recognize, Bobby," she told him during one of their increasingly infrequent visits. "All you talk about is money and business. What happened to the son who used to care about people?" Bob's romantic relationship suffered as well. The women he dated during this period consistently complained that he was never fully present, always distracted by the next deal, the next opportunity, the next level of success that seemed perpetually just beyond reach. "You love your business more than you'll ever love any person," one particularly insightful girlfriend told him before ending their relationship. But perhaps the most insidious cost was the way success began to isolate Bob from his own authentic self. The confident, visionary entrepreneur that he presented to the world was increasingly different from the uncertain, questioning man he encountered in private moments of reflection. The principles from Think and Grow Rich had indeed transformed his external circumstances, but they had also created an internal pressure to maintain an image of unwavering confidence and control. Sleep became elusive for different reasons than during his struggling period. Now, instead of worrying about unpaid bills, Bob lay awake planning expansion strategies, analyzing competitor weaknesses, and visualizing even greater levels of success. The mental techniques that had rescued him from failure had become a kind of addiction. He couldn't stop pushing, growing, achieving, even when he wasn't sure what he was pushing toward anymore. The cleaning business, while highly profitable, began to feel like a stepping stone rather than a destination. Bob found himself studying other successful entrepreneurs, reading business magazines obsessively, and developing an increasingly grandiose vision of his ultimate potential. The modest success that would have seemed miraculous during his firefighter days now felt like preliminary evidence of capabilities that demanded much greater expression. His employees began to notice the change as well. The boss, who had once worked alongside them, sharing jokes and showing genuine interest in their lives, became increasingly distant and demanding. Bob's standards for performance rose steadily, driven not by practical business needs, but by an internal compulsion toward perfection that seemed to have no natural limits. "Mr. Proctor used to be one of us," complained Maria Santos, one of his longest-serving employees. "Now he walks around like he's too important to remember our names." Success went to his head faster than wine on an empty stomach. And the psychological isolation was compounded by a growing awareness that his success had attracted attention from people whose motives were questionable. Suddenly, Bob found himself surrounded by individuals who claimed to be friends, but were clearly more interested in his growing wealth and connections than in him as a person. Learning to distinguish genuine relationships from opportunistic ones became an exhausting secondary occupation. But the most profound cost was the loss of the simple clarity that had driven his initial decision to leave the fire department. That burning sense of purpose, the conviction that he was meant for something greater, had been replaced by a more complex mixture of ambition, anxiety, and an increasingly desperate need to prove that his sacrifice had been worthwhile. The question that haunted Bob during this period wasn't whether he had made the right choice in leaving his secure job, but whether the person he was becoming was worth the price he had paid to create him. Success had given him financial freedom, social recognition, and the satisfaction of proving his critics wrong, but it had also created new forms of bondage that were more subtle and perhaps more limiting than the conventional life he had abandoned. As Bob's business empire continued to expand, he began to realize that achieving one's dreams might be easier than living with the consequences of that achievement. The man who had risked everything to follow an impossible dream was discovering that success could be its own kind of prison, and that the greatest challenge might not be reaching his goals, but deciding what to do once he got there. The legacy of an impossible decision. By the early 1970s, Bob Proctor's name had become synonymous with a particular kind of American dream. the transformation of ordinary ambition into extraordinary achievement through the sheer force of will and strategic thinking. His cleaning business had evolved into a network of 19 companies spanning multiple cities and industries, generating millions of dollars in annual revenue and employing hundreds of people. But the true measure of Bob's impact lay not in financial statements or corporate structures, but in the ripple effects of that single impossible decision made in a Toronto fire station over a decade earlier. The choice to abandon security for the unknown had created consequences that extended far beyond Bob's personal circumstances, touching the lives of family members who would spend their entire lives in the shadow of his transformation. Brian, Colleen, and Raymond Proctor grew up in a household where ordinary limitations were treated as temporary inconveniences rather than permanent facts. Their father's unwavering belief in the power of mind over circumstance created an environment where conventional wisdom was constantly questioned and extraordinary goals were discussed as natural possibilities. "Dad never let us think small," Brian would later reflect. "If we said we wanted to be teachers, he'd ask why we weren't planning to revolutionize education. If we mentioned starting a business, he'd challenge us to envision changing an entire industry." Living with that level of expectation was both inspiring and exhausting. For Linda Proctor, Bob's wife and business partner, the transformation had been equally dramatic but more complex. Her own journey from struggling insurance agent to millionaire entrepreneur had paralleled Bob's evolution, but she had retained a clearer sense of the costs involved in choosing ambition over conventional contentment. "I watched Bob wrestle with what he had become," Linda would later write. "The man who had risked everything to escape mediocrity sometimes wondered if he had traded one kind of prison for another. Success brought freedoms he had never imagined, but it also brought responsibilities and pressures that never existed in his simpler life." The influence of Bob's decision extended beyond his immediate family to the thousands of people who attended his seminars, read his books, and attempted to apply his methods to their own circumstances. For some, Bob's example provided the inspiration and practical guidance needed to create their own transformations. But for others, the attempt to replicate his journey led to financial disasters and personal disappointments that raised troubling questions about the wisdom of encouraging others to take similar risks. Margaret Chen, a nurse from Vancouver who attended one of Bob's early seminars, mortgaged her house to start a consulting business based on his principles. 2 years later, she had lost her home and was working 3 part-time jobs to pay off the debts incurred during her failed entrepreneurial venture. "Bob made it sound so simple," she later wrote in a letter to a consumer protection agency. "He never mentioned the possibility that following your dreams could destroy your life." But for every cautionary tale, there were success stories that seemed to validate Bob's central message. David Kumar, an immigrant from India who attended a Proctor seminar in 1973, used the visualization techniques to build a chain of restaurants that eventually made him one of Toronto's wealthiest businessmen. "Bob taught me that my circumstances were not my destiny," Kumar would later testify. "Without his example, I would have accepted a limited life instead of creating an extraordinary one." As Bob entered his later years, the question that haunted him most was not whether his decision had been right for him, but whether he had been responsible in encouraging others to make similar choices. The fire station decision that had seemed so personal and individual had become a public example that influenced thousands of people to take risks they might not have considered otherwise. In quieter moments, usually late at night in his study surrounded by the books and awards that documented his extraordinary journey, Bob would sometimes wonder about the alternate life he had never lived. What would have happened if he had remained a firefighter? Would he have found satisfaction in the simpler pleasures of steady work, comfortable relationships, and modest but secure achievements? "I saved people from burning buildings," he once confided to Linda during one of these reflective periods. "Now I encourage people to set their own lives on fire, metaphorically speaking. I'm not always sure which version of me did more good in the world." The final irony of Bob Proctor's impossible decision was that it had made him a prisoner of his own success story. The man who had liberated himself from conventional limitations had become obligated to maintain the image of unwavering confidence and optimism that others expected from him. The private doubts, regrets, and uncertainties that are natural parts of any human experience had to be carefully hidden to preserve the mythology that inspired others to take their own impossible risks. When Bob Proctor died in 2022, he left behind more than a business empire or a collection of motivational teachings. He left behind a question that each person must answer individually. Is the possibility of extraordinary achievement worth the certain loss of ordinary contentment? His life suggested that the answer might depend not on objective measures of success or failure, but on the deep, personal question of what kind of person you are willing to become in pursuit of what you believe you are meant to be. The firefighter's badge that Bob turned in on that cold Toronto morning in 1961 remained in his desk drawer for over 60 years. A reminder of the road not taken and the man he chose not to remain. Whether that choice represented wisdom or folly might depend as much on the observer as on the observed, but its consequences continued to ripple through the world long after the man who made it had moved beyond the reach of either praise or criticism. Conclusion: Bob Proctor's story teaches us that sometimes the craziest decisions make the most sense, but it also raises the question of whether we should all abandon security to follow our dreams, or whether Bob Proctor was simply an exceptional case of luck and perfect timing. The transformation from a struggling firefighter to a global business empire worth over $100 million seems to validate his belief that limitations are largely self-imposed and that extraordinary results are available to anyone willing to pay the price for them. But the price, as we have seen, was more complex than Bob initially understood. The decision that freed him from the constraints of conventional employment also separated him from the simple pleasures and genuine relationships that had once grounded his life. The principles that enabled his financial success also created internal pressures and external expectations that made authentic contentment increasingly elusive. Perhaps the most honest assessment of Bob Proctor's legacy is that he proved both the power and the peril of refusing to accept limitations. His life demonstrated that human beings are capable of far more dramatic change than most of us dare to attempt. But it also revealed that the pursuit of extraordinary achievement can exact costs that are only fully understood in retrospect. The question his story poses to each of us is deeply personal. What are you willing to sacrifice for the possibility of becoming everything you believe you could be? Bob Proctor's answer to that question transformed his life and influenced millions of others. But whether his choice was ultimately wise or foolish might depend on values and priorities that each person must determine for themselves. What would you do in Bob's place? Would you have the courage to abandon security for an impossible dream, or would you choose the contentment of a stable, predictable life? Leave your opinion in the comments below about where the line should be drawn between courage and recklessness. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories and click on the next video to discover other surprising cases of people who changed the world by following the impossible.